Hi, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here tonight and welcome you to our first Power Talk of the semester. I'm delighted to introduce an Athena Distinguished Fellow and a Barnard alum, our first Distinguished Fellow who is a Barnard alum, Manmeet Kaur, who's the founder of City HealthWorks. Prior to starting City HealthWorks, she served as an advisor to the 1 Million Community Health Worker Campaign and worked on community health and workforce initiatives in South Africa, in India, and also here in New York City. Manmeet's work has been featured in PBS NewsHour, The Economist, NPR, the Commonwealth Fund, Brookings, Nationswell, and I could go on and on. She earned an MBA from Columbia and obviously received her bachelor's degree here at Barnard. And Manmeet is currently a Janice Natoli Practitioner Fellow at the Urban Institute and a Draper Richard Kaplan Social Entrepreneur. She has formerly served as a PopTech Social Innovation Fellow, a GLG Social Impact Fellow, and a Third Millennium Human Rights Fellow. So join me in giving Manmeet a round of applause, welcoming her back to campus. Before I start our conversation, I want to do a brief plug for our next Power Talk. It'll be our last Power Talk of the season with Athena Distinguished Fellow Carol Evans, who is in the audience. So that's going to be on April 18th. It's a Wednesday evening, and registration is open, and you can visit our website, athenacenter.barnard.edu, to register and also sign up for our mailing list and stay tuned for other events, like our page on Facebook. We post a lot on Facebook, so stay tuned. We want tonight's conversation to be interactive, especially given the intimate group we have here. So I'm going to start off with some questions, but then we're going to open it up to the audience and source some questions from you all. So I just want you to be thinking about questions you have for Manmeet while I'm going through my list. Okay. So and there's a mic for you there. So Manmeet, can you just tell us a little bit about the origin story of City HealthWorks? This is an organization that's providing vital support to a community in need. Just talk to us a little bit about how you got there and how you started, where the idea came from.
Sure. Well, it's really nice to be here on campus, and spent a lot of hours in this room and in a different with a different label title. So it's really nice to be back. And I thought I'd start, given this is Barnard, sharing a bit of what I thought I was going to be when I grew up and what I do now, and how that journey and keeping my eyes open to how what I experienced influenced where I ended up is part of what I want to share. So I'd say initially that I was convinced always since I was a kid that I'd become a human rights lawyer. I was very passionate about issues of domestic violence, issues of immigrant rights. 9/11 happened the week I started college, and I was particularly, it was very formative in that I watched the towers fall and immediately started seeing Sikh friends being experiencing hate crimes, and was very overwhelmed by that context. I sometimes joke that I was sort of half a student and half an activist through college. I really did spend a huge chunk of my time, not just on campus, but engaged in a lot of work with community organizations and efforts initially around the anti-war activity, but more specifically focused around immigrant rights and what was happening to people who were being detained, and also was very interested in people's work conditions and the vulnerabilities that people face when they're in jobs that are not protected. And so every summer I applied for a fellowship from Barnard to help me pursue my interests in human rights, and worked with some sort of legal-oriented advocacy group, or an community immigrant rights type group. And so the fact that I did an MBA years later would have really surprised my 22-year-old or 20-year-old self. And it surprised a lot of my friends I went to college with, who were like, what is she doing? But I came out of school very interested in a specific theme around livelihoods, and particularly what it means to derive dignity through the work that you do. And that its effect is not just in giving you a paycheck, but a sense of the ability to step away from a situation that might be dangerous, the ability to change the course of one's, family's trajectory to achieve better opportunity, or and more fundamentally to feel like you are able to control your means in life. And so I came into my career very much from sort of a human rights framework, and believed that I should become a lawyer because in school, I think a lot of people who'd study liberal arts, I studied anthropology, I studied history, usually see law and PhD as like the pathways, or sort of policy director roles, And so I think I had definitely a much more limited imagination then of where my interests would take me. And so I think a big lesson in the years following, and I'll share a little bit more about what I ended up doing, but I think a big lesson for me was to allow yourself to work on solving a problem and to not be too constricted by the tools that you think you will use to apply to solve that problem. And that is like a big theme for me, both in terms of my career decisions, but also a big theme for me in terms of how I've built my organization. And I'm going to come back to that. So going back to finishing school, I was, doing academic work. I was doing a thesis. I did, a lot of activism. And I applied for one real job, not even a job, one opportunity. It's been a theme in my life. And it was to do a fellowship called the Third Millennium Human Rights Fellowship that was at that time offered for 3 students across the university to get $27K to live in 2 countries, to work with 2 organizations of your choosing, with like an amazing choice of picking an academic mentor here. So I worked with this amazing human rights lawyer who was a career person at Amnesty International for 20 years, and got to I went to Cape Town initially, and then I went to India. 1 year ended up becoming 3 years of experience working with local organizations. And initially I worked with a human rights social movement called the Treatment Action Campaign, and it was such a fascinating, eye-opening experience. It was very formative for me because I was this activist working with like one of the most famous activist movements in the at that time in the country. I mean, I think around the globe. It was a movement of about 16,000 people at that time in South Africa that was responsible for convincing the government to put ARVs, HIV treatment, on the public sector. But I found a huge realization for me in that time was I started to see the limitations of a rights-based approach. I started to see the limitations of the law. South Africa has a pretty progressive constitution. So does India. And one thing I realized was that they had a lot of actually progressive laws on paper, but the implementation of them was just an enormous gap often. India, for example, has 40 labor laws, and some of them even contradict each other. And so, I think throughout my career, and especially in that period, I became interested in this gap. And when I was at the Treatment Action Campaign, for example, I saw all these families who had now gotten access to the drugs, but they were impoverished and didn't have food security. So they were taking these very intense medications for which this, and if you take them without proper nutrition, the side effects cause all kinds of, problems. And so I became very interested in this intersection between it's one thing to get that magic policy, but then what else needs to come together? And so I didn't articulate these thoughts in that way at that time, but I started asking these questions of, what happens, in implementation. And so while I was there, I came across an organization, a small community health organization called Mamalani Projects, and just was on a hike with the woman who runs it and really fell in love with their approach. And so I'm giving you the long version of how I started City HealthWorks since we have some time together. But basically, I met this woman and I joined her organization, and we were really passionate about this importance of helping people find good work who needed health services, or who were in need of health, who were facing health crises. And we started a yogurt making business for people who were beneficiaries of their health education workshops. It was a very formative 4 months for me. I literally, my kitchen, the office was my kitchen. I convinced the fellowship people to let me stay in South Africa for a majority of my fellowship year and shorten my time in India. And I said, I just have this amazing thesis I need to answer for myself. Let me stay here longer. They were like, sure. But basically, I had this feeling that if we could teach these people to make yogurt, to sell it to people in their township, they could create a job, but it's also a product that helps them with their management of their own health. But what it taught me was I worked with these 4 or 5 individuals, and I saw in each of them this powerful effect of building a sense of ownership in their work. And I'll give you an example. One of them was Siswa, who was never really paying attention. He was an orphan who was now 18, but like every time we would talk about some topic, it might have been like the bacteria that you need to mix into the milk to get it to, or it might have been the accounting for how to keep track of the yogurt sales. It was hard to get him to pay attention, and I got irritated one day because he was like on his phone. And I realized one day I realized that he was very hesitant about a lot of the tasks because he'd never spoken to someone who was not Black South African. Because I was asking him to make the phone call to milk suppliers. And so I had to it took my patience to listen to what he wasn't saying, but what I realized was his fear. And so I kind of worked with them. And so I share that story to say that this was a really important moment for me to realize when someone has not had that opportunity to be treated with that sense of dignity, it is hard to tell them to do something if they don't feel it themselves. And so I kind of coached him on how to have that conversation. And after he did it a couple of times, that was then a step towards feeling more confident or interested or curious to do the next thing. And so I sort of became obsessed with this theme of how powerful it is when you can help someone find that sense of ownership, and as a result, a sense of dignity in who they are and what they can accomplish. And so then fast forward, I ended up spending not a year abroad, but 3 years. I spent 2 years after that in India with an organization called LaborNet in Bangalore that was a social enterprise in the construction industry that was more focused on the workforce and livelihood side. And then I came back home to New York. This is now 3 years after college. And I will say that this was a point in my life where I was very unsure and insecure of what do I do? What is my career? I had this opportunity. I went abroad and I did this great work. But what is my profession? And so I was like, all right, it's time to apply to law school. And it was around that time that I met my husband, Prabjot, who's here, and he was in the middle of his MD, PhD, and at that time working on the side at initially the International Rescue Committee, and then at the Earth Institute on community health worker systems. So I was very intrigued by this idea of a community health worker in a more formal sense. I was exposed to this concept in my work, but it was there's different titles, But I wanted to focus on what I thought I was going to do at that juncture. I thought I was going to apply to law school. I even found the other day I had even written out my whole full application and study for the test, and realized that I had started to recognize that there was limitations of what I could do in addressing the problem I was most interested with the law. And then secondly, realized I really didn't enjoy studying for the LSAT. And the more I could, looking at what people do day to day in those roles, I didn't really see myself in it. And I think that was, for me, a very hard decision because I was very attached to the idea of this is the way in which I was going to solve problems that I cared about. And so I spent, a bit of time and then decided to apply to MBA programs. And ended up going to Columbia. So I had a 5-year period in between college and business school. And came to Columbia after having, 5 years of work experience and this interest in community health workers. And so I came to school with this question, and I often encourage people who are going to graduate school to go in with a question that you want to solve. It doesn't need to be an organization, but I found it very, very helpful. In getting, not just helping me focus my idea, but on starting this organization, but also get the most out of school. So I started business school with this question of, is there a role that a non-clinician, a person who's hired from the communities that they serve, the umbrella term for this is community health workers, but in different countries they have different names or titles. And I questioned whether there's a role they can play in the U.S. healthcare system, particularly given the burden of chronic illnesses that are lifelong and ongoing. And more specifically, I was interested in seeing, could I prove the business case behind this workforce? And so I became sort of very convinced that if I could build a solution, especially build it at scale, it would influence policy. It would influence the way systems operate. It would influence behaviors and norms in an industry. And if there were relevant sort of like legal policies that it might influence, I thought it would be more powerful through demonstration. And so I sort of started with that question. And then used school essentially to study the industry, build a business plan, pitch it, and started this journey of growing the organization. So I'll pause there for a second. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. My mic turned off. It's interesting because we teach a lot about entrepreneurship at the Athena Center. We think entrepreneurship is a very interesting tool to help students discover their own agency. So hearing you talk about somebody discovering their own dignity is very similar. And when we're talking about entrepreneurship with our high schoolers that come for our summer camp, Natalie Molina Nino, who runs our entrepreneurship program, always starts with the question, like, what bugs you? You know, what is it out there? What issue have you come across in your community and your family that really gets under your skin? And that's the ideation phase. That's where they, launch the entire kind of process of thinking about how you can turn what bothers you into a solution and therefore an organization or a business. So it's nice to hear that that's happening lots of other places. We talk a lot about women in entrepreneurship, particularly being at Barnard, being the Athena Center. So as a female entrepreneur, if you can just talk about maybe one or two of the major challenges you faced as a female founder, and for those future founders in the room, if you had one or two pieces of advice you'd like to pass along, what would they be?
Yeah. I think before I jump into the challenges, I would say that as a female founder, I've really enjoyed playing to my strengths as a woman in building this organization. So I'm going to start there.
Yeah, I like it.
Part of what was a little jarring for me going to business school was that it was a very male environment. I went to Barnard. I worked in nonprofits and social movements. I was surrounded by a lot of women. And I remember coming home and crying to my husband the first week during orientation and being like, this is like corporate frat culture. What have I done? Like, oh my God, I literally was crying. I remember those days. And I was like, I should have gone to law school. What did I do? But I knew I wanted to learn those skills. Like in my work experience, I was studying things like marketing on my own. I was trying to understand accounting. I was like teaching myself these things. So I was very clear that I wanted to be there for what I was going to learn. And I think it was very important for me to feel uncomfortable and not just be in these more comfortable environments in which I was always surrounded by people who I really loved their ideas, and I felt like I really, not always agreed, but just it was. And I would really encourage, I think that the most important growing I have done in my life, and I would say much of why I've been able to build the skills, because you're not born knowing how to run an organization. So there's a reason why usually entrepreneurs or people who run organizations do it later in their career, because there's a lot involved, a lot of responsibility. But I think that I've been able to move in getting, much of it has enabled me to figure things out and to feel like a different person today than I did 3 years ago, 5 years ago, a year ago, 10 years ago. Like it's a constant journey. It's being pushed and being very, almost seeking feedback. And so I would say also, not just seeking feedback on an individual level, but seeking to see different ways in which people accomplish things and different ways in which people solve for solutions. And so it really opened my mind and my horizon a lot being in school, in business school. I would say that as a female starting an organization, it was a very interesting year. The Can Women Have It All article came out, and I was deciding to have a child right after. And my husband and I were, at a point where we were definitely ready to have our first kid. And I was sure I didn't want to do a job like consulting where I was going to be moving around a lot. And so part of why I started it then was because I did not believe I was going to be an entrepreneur after school. I didn't even really self-identify as one. I was obsessed with this question and this problem. And so my husband kind of pushed me to say, like, treat it like you're answering this question. But there's like a hilarious moment that I love to sometimes share with people that, he was kind of pushing me to like say to myself, I am starting a business. My name is Manmeet. Just to give you a sense of how much, when I was in school, I really saw this more as like I'm studying something. It was really important to have, people who love, I think it's very important to have people who love you to say, very honestly, give you advice, but also to say, imagine who you're going to be 3 years from now, and kind of to lift your mind from seeing who you are right now to imagine and almost visualize who you could be. And I think that has been something I'm very fortunate to have in my partner very consistently over, ups and downs, and oftentimes where you don't want to hear something and it's really helpful. And very importantly, when you don't always succeed, because it's often you hear talks when people are showing a moment of success, but there are lots of those moments that don't feel so good. And so I would say what was both a challenge in business school as a female founder was a strength I felt was I came in with a lot of different experiences that my peers didn't have. So I was seen as sort of someone who was a non-traditional business school student coming in with different experiences and different kind of worldviews. And it stood out. And I'd say a challenge was me coming into my own sense of confidence that I could start this now. And I partly, I think that the other big part of that was just when I started looking at what's happening in the industry and the market, I realized in my market research, there really isn't yet something out there that's doing what I'm doing. And, let me try it now. And so I'd say a second part of the, there are many things I could say in terms of challenges of starting the organization, but I think a second challenge after the school phase and building it, I graduated business school in 2012. So now I've been operating and growing an enterprise for the past 5 years. It has been in terms of being a female founder, it is not, you don't see as many of your faces in positions of leadership. I don't actually think about it all the time. I actually don't think about it when I'm looking at someone that like they're an executive and I'm a female exec. It's not something I'm consciously thinking about usually. But I've had more poignant moments, especially as I was moving out of the like intensive operational phase of just building and growing and being very inwardly focused, and had to do more interactions or certain interactions externally where I realized, oh, I'm definitely being perceived for being, and I think being petite also contributes to maybe certain perceptions. And so I think it was important at certain junctures for me to not be naive and to not just be like, I'm Manmeet and I'm talking, but to be conscious of those interactions and to think about, well, how am I being perceived, and to know it and sort of, sit with it. And I think it made me, explore not just how I was presenting myself, but pushed me to think about ways in which I could change the dynamic of a room or change the dynamic of an interaction. And it's been so interesting to go through interactions and then look back a year later and be like, oh, if I were to go into that now, I have a totally different way in which I'd handle it, and then see yourself do it in another interaction. And I think a lot of that comes with experience, plus having mirrors around you. So people who are really honest. And I've been very fortunate to build that in my team as well. Colleagues who will say like, you could have, said this a little differently when meet there, or or this was like great, or celebratory moments when they're like awesome, and we joke. My team jokingly calls me boss lady, and in part because one of them in particular knew early on that I wasn't so comfortable owning that.
Right.
And jokingly, it's even on my mug, my coffee mug. So I think that the challenge of recognizing who you are today versus how you are perceived today versus how you want to craft how you are perceived is not an easy journey, and I think it's an incredibly rewarding one when you start to feel more of a sense of ownership over not just allowing people to perceive who you are based on how you present, how you are, how you look, or how you talk, but being able to influence and shape it more directly. It's sort of a long-winded answer, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask people to start calling me boss lady because I think that's amazing. I want to touch on one point you brought up, which was that during your market research, you didn't see organizations that were out there utilizing the business model that you had envisioned or serving the population that you wanted to serve in the way you wanted to serve them.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about what City HealthWorks does, how you chose that structure, but also who are your community health workers, who are your beneficiaries. We always, at Athena, we like to explore innovative business models, entrepreneurial models that are employing women, that are impacting women. So tell us a little bit about who you work with and who you employ.
Sure. So the organization hires, it's called City HealthWorks, and we hire and train people to become health coaches. And these are individuals who are from the neighborhoods that we serve, who have a minimum of a high school education. And our whole philosophy is that if you find someone who has that experience growing up in a similar neighborhood, they're going to be able to relate to the person they're talking to in a way that the most charismatic or empathic nurse or social worker may not be able to. And so we hire clinicians who supervise them, and essentially our team of workers go and meet people wherever it's convenient to them in their home, et cetera. And we work with people who have chronic illnesses, who are mostly older, but are having trouble understanding these complicated conditions and medications and need support learning how to become more independent in managing them at home. And so so it's both a health solution, but the kind of solution behind how we address it is building this community-based workforce. In terms of the market and what I was learning, I studied the market particularly while I was a student, by going and talking to patients, people who would be potential patients in East Harlem. I shadowed clinicians to see, what was the nature of their interactions with patients in those visits, what was happening, with interactions with social workers. I talked to experts. I would go and email people who are seen as, wrote papers or who were seen as influencers to say, I have this idea, can you talk to me? I did, obviously secondary research. Another big part of my market research, though, was I did a summer internship at a place that was employing these kind of workers at New York Presbyterian to see how were they doing it. And it was particularly when I was there seeing, face-to-face, one program, that I realized that this is a pretty nascent field, and that most people who are employed in these roles are on stipends, on grant-funded projects that are not part of scaled enterprises. So that it was clear that there wasn't really much of a market yet of the entities like that, but there was a growing interest in the industry.
And you went to Barnard, and you founded your organization to work in Harlem and Morningside Heights. You're from New York. You're a native New Yorker. How has that shaped kind of your leadership journey? You went abroad, and then you came back. Like, how did that happen, and why?
So New York is home. In terms of just being in Upper Manhattan, I certainly saw this as the place that we would start. And I always knew that I was going to go abroad for a period of time, but was going to come home. I enjoy working in the geography. I like doing place-based work. So working in the place that I'm working, or living rather. That said, my ambition is certainly to scale City HealthWorks and to use Harlem as our demonstration site to prove it works and get it operationally ready. And in this coming year, we're going to begin putting boots on the ground in new geographies. In terms of how it shaped my leadership, I love New York. I mean, I was very my interest in going abroad was I was sort of obsessed with it. My family's from India. I went to India once when I was 10, and going there through this fellowship was the second time in my life that I got to go, and I was very fond of my grandparents. There was a personal element of wanting to spend time with them. But I also had this itch to go abroad because my parents have a dry cleaning shop, and I grew up working weekends and summers in the shop, and grew up speaking Spanish just as fluently as I was, speaking Punjabi with my parents, and loved hearing their stories, loved building relationships with them, and so I think that my journey was definitely also shaped by my exposure to people from different countries, my sort of human rights interest in the experience of immigrants. And a desire to see what the world was like beyond New York. But I came back to New York and have really enjoyed building this in a city, in a place where I grew up, and also being here to kind of start raising our family. So,
Great. And I want to pick up on one thing you mentioned earlier in terms of your trajectory and how you thought you were going to be a lawyer, and then after working in policy, you realized the limitations. And decided you wanted to be a practitioner and work in the field. That being said, we're living in an interesting time under an interesting administration that is making interesting, I'm choosing my words carefully, that is making interesting decisions when it comes to public health and healthcare policy. And so I'm just interested in hearing a little bit about your perspective because, as you say, you are the boots on the ground. You're working with some of our most vulnerable populations, and particularly for the women that you're serving. In an ideal world, if there was one, you could wave your magic wand and there was one policy that you could see enacted that would have a palpable, measurable impact for women, but broader for vulnerable populations and the population you're serving, what would it be?
I'll say what my specific policy thing that I think is very important, but I want to first say that this period of our political environment has actually only reinforced for me my thesis of the importance of practice influencing policy. I think that the distance that people on the ground feel from these big our governance and structures, especially at the national level, is so huge and so vast that we're in a moment where there's an opportunity to think less nationally and more nationally through local. And I think that there's an opportunity to build solutions that are that people can feel and experience, that also connects them to civic engagement or understanding of how policies in their community or in this country affect those experiences. And so I think I feel more emboldened about the importance of hiring people locally, getting them to be more educated about their health, because in doing so, we are getting them to be more educated about their neighborhood, what's happening what's happening about the closure of a grocery store, what's happening about, ways that they can be involved. I think we've been so focused on just the core solution so far, but what inspires me most about what I envision at scale is that we have community health coaches, community health workers in cities and towns, in rural environments across the country, who are out there and ready to mobilize when there is a problem, who are out there and ready to help people become more knowledgeable about their involvement in civic engagement, what it means, to just be. So I feel increasingly more focused on building what we're doing, particularly given this in climate. From a policy perspective, one policy which again is a bit more structural is the way in which healthcare is paid for. That the fee-for-service environment is a huge driver of why our costs of care are so astronomical. Healthcare is 70% of the U.S. GDP, and also a big part of why higher value care, like the kind of care that our non-clinician workers are delivering, is not yet valued in the way very expensive care is. And so that would be my for policy specific.
That's great. I have one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. I don't want to dominate you. And this is actually just fresh in my mind because we're coming off of the Athena Film Festival. And in our conversations with female filmmakers, especially younger filmmakers, one of the comments that we hear again and again is that it took them this long to get started because they didn't feel like they had the expertise. They didn't know how to work the equipment. They'd never been on a set before. They didn't feel like they had the relevant subject matter expertise to really dive in and follow their passions and explore what being a filmmaker could mean. And so I'm just curious, you said you studied anthropology and then you went to business school, so you weren't pre-med, you didn't go to medical school, and now you find yourself working in the trenches in healthcare. What has that been like, and what advice would you give to your younger self or the students in the room when they're thinking about, taking a liberal arts degree and doing something in a field that's unrelated to what they studied here at Barnard?
Oh, great question. For me, it's been, I think, I'm never feeling like I'm done. Like I never feel like I finished mastering and learning what I need to do in my job. I think that's an important thing. That's a reality also of our generation. We're not going to have the kind of jobs that some of our parents have had for, not my dad, but many of our parents had for like 30, 40 years, and then you have this pension, and that's what you do, this trade that you've been trained highly to do. So I think one thing is recognizing, I'm not really ever done, and that I'm always a student, I'm always a learner. I think one practical piece of advice that was helpful for me from business school was to know what is so my quick practical advice is to figure out in different chunks of your career, what is the content of what you know that you've grown expertise in. You don't need to be, I don't mean they're becoming a PhD in it, but like mastering through some level of work experience or combination of education. And what is it that you do from a functional perspective? And I'm coming off a week of interviewing a bunch of candidates for a job, so it's on my mind. But like, what is that? I think that a lot of there's a lot of distance between what people perceive when they graduate college versus what's out there in terms of the kinds of roles you can have. Like for me, I really didn't know what I could be since I wasn't on the pre-med track, or I wasn't, I didn't know what I could be besides a doctor or a lawyer or like a PhD in anthropology or, And so I struggled with that question a lot. And I remember particularly with like 3 years out of college, 3-4 years, feeling like really jealous of my friends who went down the medical path, because it was like, you don't need to ask yourself this question anymore. Like, you just know what you're doing. And I was very tormented by like, what is it that I do? What is this next step? So I think that, one, recognize that many people grapple with this question and they don't necessarily stop grappling with that question. So to kind of ease that anxiety that I think is pretty common for a lot of folks. But I wish that myself, graduating Barnard, had more of a sense of like, what are these other jobs that people do? And I think it's fun to learn that through talking to people and being like, what is this job that you do? And kind of like look at places that are addressing things you care about, but really see like, what is it that people are doing in these roles, and then work, when you find people who are doing things that you are interested in, and pay attention to what that day-to-day feels like, because when you end up doing something, like for me, I was starting to realize that day-to-day of being a lawyer, it was just not gonna be, for me, as rewarding, or that I wouldn't be as good as I thought I could be in it either. The understanding what people are doing and then how they got there. And then recognizing that there's not always a prescription for those roles, and kind of being, always having your eyes open to different ways of approaching roles.
So naturally, you're willing to have conversations with all of the Barnard students in the room about what your day-to-day is like. Okay, so I want to pause here for a minute and take some questions from the audience. Just raise your hand, ask your question. I'm going to repeat your question so it's captured in the audio for our recording. But do you have any takers? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm April, sorry, and I have a question about how you found like agency, specifically like financial agency and like networking, creating your business and entrepreneurship within this very specific field.
Great. So the question is about how you specifically found your agency and tapped into the network that you needed to launch a business in this very specific field.
That's a good question. I will say I did not have pre-existing relationships in this field, and that it has definitely been a journey. Uh, that um, Well, I'm going to first take your first part of your question in terms of how did I find financial agency. I wanted to share earlier, I didn't share. I do want to share one thing personally first, is that I came to school and then a year after school left home and was not supported by my parents, my dad particularly, throughout the rest of college. I worked 4 jobs, I took out loans, and I became, what I realized in retrospect is that that experience really taught me a ton about how to use a network. And when I say I was nervous about leaving Barnard, I was very scared about leaving the security, because this was like became a replacement of the security of also like a parent home, environment. I really built very meaningful relationships with certain faculty and deans who helped me figure out all that. And so I think that I've reflected more recently how much this sort of survival instinct in me built this ability to scan and figure out who can help me at different moments for different things that I would need. And I think I also just really enjoy relationship building. When I know I'm talking to someone from whom I can learn, like I really enjoy that. And so I think that when you are building a relationship with someone, and not just like saying I want you to help me, but you're talking about when you have passion about a topic, people will remember you. And I think one of the very influential things that my husband said when I was super nervous about the idea of starting City Health Works versus taking the security of a job after business school was, he said, the networking you're going to do when you talk to people about your business idea in school is going to be way more fruitful than the networking you would do by just saying, I'd love to hear about your career. Can you tell me how you got there? And that was truly a significant turning point, because I was very insecure about taking the risk of starting a business when I had student loans from undergrad, and I was bringing into a young marriage life also. Just we were starting with more debt, and so that was very it was so true, and it like shifted my perspective a lot. And I would say my journey in building these relationships has been forming meaningful relationships, and I would say like there's sort of a tighter circle that you realize are people who you're going to go to a lot, and then and whom you are building meaningful relationships because they're getting something also from you and learning and recognizing that exchange is not just one way. And then more specifically, I would say I started this when I was in business school. And my husband and I were really kind of co-partners in thinking through the idea. He was in residency, and we were both asking these questions together. So we together were just talking to tons of people. He starting through his medical school world, and I in business school. So every single class I took, I applied this idea to my class project. Then I had a whole group of students on a class project working with me on whether it was marketing class, and I was like, let's look at the marketing channels for City Health Works, or let's look at this is a decision modeling class, and I took this data set and we created like a data model for what would be the ideal ratio of supervisors to coaches. Those were opportunities for networking because those students I worked with like remembered me more in that way. Faculty I would go and talk to, they remembered me more because they were like, oh, she's, like they would email me when they had an idea or read something that was relevant. So I'd say that I particularly leveraged business school because that was when I was starting it, and I talked to alumni. Almost every relationship that I built was either through, not almost every, but a lot of them came through like someone I met through school during that time. Yeah, so you don't need to, I think it's an example of like you can go into an industry and if you're really resourceful about finding people and learning and like you can find those resources, yeah. My first donation came from an alum, and then I can share more about the specifics around how I then started raising money, but.
Yep, go ahead.
How do you like navigate that?
Great question. Actually, when I started, my dream was for it to be schools were not the only site, but a major site of where our coaching would happen. And we got to know a lot of the schools in the neighborhood because of this one. I cared about both demographics, but also because when you can influence the people making the meals or the parental, it's going to have an effect on kids. Vice versa, sometimes kids are more motivating to their parents when they learn something. And then also they can be a barrier. So if you get one interested and the other one's not interested in the home, it's going to be harder. The reason why we haven't yet focused as much on youth and families is because from the business case perspective, patients who are already sick with chronic conditions come to the emergency room for avoidable cases more frequently than young people, except in the case of asthma and children. And so we started, and in any business, you need to start with narrowing to some degree the segment that you work on. And so, but at the moment, we're actually developing a pre and postnatal coaching program to engage mothers and children now. So we're starting that sooner than I thought we would. Yeah.
Congratulations. Other questions? Yeah.
Mine's a good follow-up to that. Thank you. This has been super inspiring. I'm a full spectrum doula, so I do abortion and birth work. So a community worker, some you could say. And I'm really interested in the idea of how, what's the revenue model behind getting that to scale? And one thought I had is you work with employers or unions and you sell it as, especially if you're self-insured, then you have a business case to keep health costs low. But from a personal philosophy standpoint, that doesn't feel right to have to have, you have to have a good job to be able to access that. Would you mind talking a little bit more about your revenue model and how you see that evolving?
Great. Yeah, great questions and great work. I'm a fan of the world of doulas. And so and the work that you guys do that it's not recognized. So the healthcare spending is very high, as I mentioned. There's in the past couple of years been research that has shown that people who are more vulnerable typically tend to incur higher cost in their medical spending, or the countries ends up spending more because they're not utilizing preventive care as early, and also because people who face more vulnerabilities from a social and economic perspective have less access to healthy food, less access to stability of employment, less access to things that are that increase the likelihood of health crises happening earlier. And so there's one statistic is that 50% of our healthcare spending is on 5% of the population. So this really caught my eye, and as I dug in deeper, learned that people who have chronic illnesses, there are other subgroups, but there's just a higher rate of spending, and so that we're still working on making this business case spread to many more and more payers, insurers to pay for it, but we certainly are on sort of hitting a tipping point of getting insurers to see, oh, you guys are saving us a lot of money. And the folks that we're working with, 95% of them live below the poverty line, average age is 63. These are folks who are highly vulnerable. Most of them have cognitive or physical or some other limitations. And so I would say, I'd love to talk more, we are just beginning to look at this, the pre-postnatal population, because we're going to be doing some more digging in the specifics around how to build that business case there. But I know we'll find it. So I'm happy to talk more about it.
Great. Next question. Carol?
I'm just curious about how you work with other, other organizations, like city health organizations, other nonprofits, for-profit. How do you integrate with them, or do you?
Yeah, no, we do. So one formal area of integration is that we partner with clinics and hospitals, so they send us patients and we communicate back and forth. And then we're now forming partnerships with insurance companies to pay for it. So that's the sort of medical side. We are encountering people who have a vast range of social vulnerabilities. So we particularly around food insecurity and particularly around getting people access to more specialized case managers, we have a very robust level of interaction with social service providers. And we don't just make referrals, often we're escorting that person to a place because they feel a little bit hesitant about going, or and we get to know case managers at those partner agencies because we want to not just refer, we want to know what happened, what's going on. So we have a higher level of kind of involvement in that journey of someone interacting with another service, because we also want to know, did it work out well before we send someone again. So there's a high, particularly around food pantries and groups like God Love Deliver, with a lot of interactions there. So in terms of the care delivery, those are some of the ways we partner.
And with the government, is there government agencies that you interact
Not directly. I mean, we mostly are serving people who are on Medicaid or Medicare or who are uninsured, so that we work a lot with the New York City's safety net system, with New York City Health and Hospitals. So that's sort of a government entity of providers. The Harlem Hospital, Metropolitan Hospital. And because most of the patients that we're serving are covered by government insurance, we essentially are, but not necessarily directly with like an agency in that way. Though I think it's going to grow over time. We're now developing sort of some more policy-oriented recommendations to the Department of Health at the state level. That, yeah.
could become more?
Great. Yep.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. It's been really incredibly inspiring. But obviously, like, I'm really interested in city health work, but I want to take it back a little bit to how, I mean, you were saying how you really didn't expect yourself to be in healthcare as much as, because you were so interested in activism and human rights. How do you, I mean, I know that you started your own company, but how do you find yourself breaking into an industry that you don't really have experience in? Because I'm finding myself in that situation right now where, I do research, but I'm interested in something else. And so I don't really have the experience. And of course, I understand networking is a huge role, but what are other things that I can do to boost, my resume or whatever it might be to show employers if I was going to start my company that, I'm serious about this, even though I don't have as much experience.
Yeah, great question. The way in which I liked, I learned well through doing. So I learned a lot through. I started learning a lot about the industry through a combination of ways. So one was talking to people, shadowing, trying to go see directly what that experience of care feels like for people as providers as well as patients and their family members. I think that's a very valuable thing to try to, and that's something one could maybe do as like a volunteer, or just to say to someone. I would encourage also, I think I did a lot of asking, can I come and just watch you? Or can I come and just, there's just no harm in asking, and not always finding ways to learn through a formal, like, publicized experience. So that's one suggestion. I think a second one was that through that process, I just found out what people were working on. So in business school, while I was a student, I did 2 projects. Like, one was for the Cornell group of hospitalists. I just got to know a doctor there, and they were interested in readmissions, and I was like, can I work on this? And so they were like, oh, this student wants to help us do interviews with patients. And so I got to go and interview these patients who were frequently readmitted. And it wasn't like a publicized project. It was just, I was talking to people and found this project. So I think through talking to, you uncover ways to learn something, and not always something that someone's telling you, but if you can identify something that you think you could add value to just say, hey, have you thought of looking at it this way, or could I help you study this, or could I give you a little research project on something that would help your work? Especially when it's something where that person, that busy organization or person, doesn't have to give a lot of direct supervision for, people are more welcoming. I'd say another tip was to, I audited some classes at the Mailman School of Public Health, so I didn't do an MPH because I didn't want to add another degree at that time, just it's like time and wanting to have a family and debt and stuff. And so but I did audit some courses, and I found some structured, coursework like that was helpful. I also used Coursera. I took a class on nutritional management of chronic illnesses. I took a class on, I took a bunch of Coursera courses. I formed relationships with people who I started this with. So I would really emphasize that I did not start this alone. I did not, this is not, most, very few inventions in the world are started by a person. You know, I formed, you know, for the first like 2 or 3 years, especially when I was a student, it was a lot of conversation between my husband and I, sort of ideas about this and learning and our, you know, and us processing from our different places of where we were experiencing healthcare in the U.S. from. I had 10 people who were volunteering when I was a student at the end of business school. There were like 10 people, because through conversation, there were like people who would say to me, oh, I want to work on this with you. 2 in particular. One was a Barnard student. I came here and gave a talk. Actually, it was this girl, Justine, who on the side of her full-time job worked with me. Another one was a woman who was a doctor from the UK who was here for 2 years doing an MPH while her husband was stationed here for his job. I literally learned, I asked her all the stupid questions. What is diabetes? Exactly what does this mean? Can you explain this to me? And then the 2 of us went and talked to all of these clinicians, and she was fascinated as a practitioner, as a doctor from a very different environment, how different it is here. So I'm more of a social learner too, so I kind of found people to work with me. And I will also say that when I graduated and I was alone with my idea, and then kind of, you know, with a baby and outside of the social environment of school, I got very depressed and very unsure about my ability to do this. And you know, as much as you have encouragement in a partner, like there's only so much when you feel like you can't, you know, it's too much. Once I hired my first hire, my motivation just went through the roof. So I would really say, for me at least, having people to work with has always been a very important part of my own ability to stay excited to do this job, you know. And so that really changed things. And like that moment in 2013, January, when she started, like I was like, oh my gosh, I have an employee. I better be ready. I better be motivated. I better have a smile on my face. You know, like I think it, so that was, I'll think of other things too, but that was sort of my main. Mm-hmm.
Maybe one final question? Yeah?
How do you see yourself expanding throughout New York City?
How do you see yourself expanding throughout New York City?
One is that I'm going to convert it into a company.
Oh, yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. We raised philanthropy. So to date, I've raised 6.5 million in philanthropy and $1 million in earned revenue contracts from hospitals. So it's not like we've not been able to raise philanthropy, but this journey of raising philanthropy from mostly very reputable sources, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Robin Hood have been some our main initial donors, Draper Richards Kaplan, et cetera. It's a very different culture of funding, and it's very nicely aligned with when you're testing an idea. Because it's project-based, you don't have the pressure of giving it back. You don't have the pressure of, you know, hitting revenue targets before you really have solidified what that solution should be. So I've had the luxury with philanthropy of really taking the time to meaningfully design it in a way that solved the need of making sure our patients, our coaches, our clinicians love the service. Not worrying about like a shareholder interest or whatever. At this juncture, I think it's going to really hold us back. I genuinely feel that because philanthropy is very often project-oriented, not coordinated with each other, so you have a group of people funding or different sources, and they have different theories of change, and you have different, it's a lot of effort of time to administrate that, and I find that often that it distracts you from your core work. At this stage, what we need money for is support to invest in our technology and our organizational infrastructure to grow. We're not really testing out how it works. We know it works. We have now 3 studies that are showing with controls that our impact in clinical outcomes, our impact in cost savings is tremendous enough that it's worth paying for. So it's a longer conversation, but the type of financing that I think is best aligned with taking something that works and helping it scale is why we're going to transition it to a for-profit entity so that I can raise growth-oriented money that's patient. The second way in which we're going to scale is through, you know, getting our operations prepared and strong enough so that we have a central, you know, entity that enables regional teams to grow. Mm-hmm.
Great question. Unless, I mean, we have a little time. I can take one more if anyone's got a burning question. Okay.
I just had a question about, like, I know it's really difficult to sometimes penetrate the healthcare industry,
In the public health side of it, it's been sometimes interesting in that it rubbed certain people the wrong way, which surprised me. And I think because I found that there were people who were advocates for the idea of a community health worker who are very wedded to, like, you know, an approach. For example, there's been movements to certify community health workers in different states. And I don't disagree with the spirit of the certification, but if there isn't an industry to hire them, then what are you certifying them for? And I think so I think that there have been sometimes, like, not very substantive, but just reactions from people who have been working on an issue for a long time, and they feel like, who are you to, you know, like, come in here? So that happens, and I would say, like, when you're starting something new, don't expect that everyone's going to be like, oh, what a great idea. I think that another challenge has certainly been how to build credibility at different stages. I've been now working on this since 2010. I started the idea, and so, you know, I was certainly kind of quite obsessed with this notion of how do I get credibility behind the idea, but then get enough credibility behind the idea to get some resources, and I think what has helped is, you know, defining milestones of what you think will be enough to get the next level of support, not just financial, but like partnership or engagement or people talking about it, to then say to the next stage of, you know, places that you're looking to get money from or support from, here's who's validating our idea, or here's now some data that's validating our idea. And so I think contextualizing your expectations for where you're at, whether it's an idea that you're working on or an organization, kind of contextualizing it with where your stage of evolution there, but then looking forward and figuring, you know, setting an ambition for, like, this is where I hope it's going to be, and constantly asking people, is this a reasonable set of expectations and timing, and how can I validate my ideas at different stages? Yeah. I'm happy to chat more about that theme, but I think the other piece is that every industry has its own complications. Healthcare is really messy and busy, but I think that once we started getting some real data, it was a really fun sell. I think I had found selling before we had some data a lot more personally challenging, but you have to, you know, believe in your idea to get other people to believe that you can do it. But especially when I had some more, like, traction, you know, it was more fun to get people. So so we've served about 800 patients. Some key highlights are for people who were part of our first wave of patients who had uncontrolled diabetes. On average, the blood sugar reduction a year was 1.6. So that's, for folks who are not clinicians, if you're on the drug for metformin, the best in class medication for diabetes, the average reduction is 1.5. One of our doctors likes to joke it's better than metformin with only good side effects. But it's meaningful in part because the patients we served are patients who the clinician said, we've tried everything, and these are folks who were consistently struggling to take control of their health. 83% of those patients had some reduction. And at week 10 of engagement in our service, there was a $600 per member per month drop in spending. And by month 5, it was a $900. By month 5, it was a $900 per member per month drop in spending. We are now getting data on our impact on patients who have asthma, uncontrolled asthma, congestive heart failure, which is a much higher cost kind of segment of the population. So our early signs are pretty strong.
Great. All right, well, join me in thanking Manmeet for being here tonight, and we'll stick around for a little bit to answer any other questions. Thank you, guys. We'll see you April 18th for our next Power Talk. Thank you all for coming.